Greetings once again to another BNE podcast. Before I get started, I have two house things. One, if you're on the Zoom call, then please, you're invited to ask questions in the chat function. You'll find a button down at the bottom, and we will try and deal with those as we go. I say to Alexander and Nigel to have a look at the chat. If you see something relevant, one of the questions, then please, you can bring it up and insert into the conversation. This is being streamed via Zoom. It'll also it's being live streamed on our YouTube channel, and there'll be a recording of it as soon as we get off. And we're also streaming on Twitter. What's it called? Twitter. I forget the name. The Spaces, of course. So for all our audio video hearers, welcome to this. And there'll be a podcast version on our own website at the end. You can find links to all of that if you go to bne.eu/welcome. There are links there to the YouTube channel and the podcast. And there are also some goodies. I encourage you to sign up to Editor's Picks, which is a free email digest we do every day from the best stories from the last 24 hours. And if you're in the game, a professional, and you want a lot more information, then please take a trial to our premium version, IntelliNews Pro, where all our reporters from across the region are filing every day. You can have a look at that via bne.eu/welcome. So with that, I would like to welcome Alexander Titov, who is a lecturer in Belfast on modern history and a Russia follower. We've been on panels before. And also to Nigel Gould-Davis, who's a former British ambassador to Belarus, and he's now a fellow at IIS, which stands for, Nigel, IIS is what exactly?
It's the International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Right. And also a Russia Watcher expert. We actually happily met in the pub in London last week, where there's a sort of Russian night, and started a conversation, which was actually the inspiration for doing this podcast. But of course, let's dive straight in, because the big news has been President Xi Jinping has been in Moscow for 3 days with Putin in what looks like it could be a historic meeting, because with everything going on, my takeout from it was that China has actually gone up a gear, because until now it's sort of kept its head down and let Putin take the lead in relationships with the West and do all the fighting. But by coming out so strongly in support of Putin, in defiance of the states, by turning up and going to see Putin, who is now a pariah and also, a criminal on the run after he's been indicted by the ICC, was a pretty strong message. Having said that, everyone's been chewing through what was actually said. And the takeout is that Putin offered a lot and said a lot had been done, but the Chinese side said virtually nothing concrete. And one of the takeouts has been that now Putin's sort of bent the knee to Xi Jinping, and that Russia is very much a junior partner, that he's given up on his aspirations to become a superpower, and he's basically going to have to do what Beijing tells him. So Alexander, I could start with you, because we were tweeting about this phrase, junior partner. And again, the Western take in the press I've been reading is like, Putin's just lost it. He's now slave to China. He's got no power control at all. But this nature, what exactly is the nature of the junior partner? Because, there's still, Beijing is now upping its energy dependence on Russia, although that's going slowly. And then specifically that deal, the Paris-Siberia 2 deal, that Putin said it's almost done. The Chinese, though, if you look through the joint statement, gas wasn't even mentioned. Novak came out this morning, Russia's point guy on energy, and said the deal is in its final stages and should be completed by the end of the year. But I remember when Xi came to Moscow 10 years ago, last time he got elected president, and they started the negotiations on Paris-Siberia 1. And then that went on for years because they couldn't agree on the price. And I think to this day, we still don't know how much the Chinese are paying for Russian gas. So what's your thoughts? Is Russia a junior partner? And if so, what does that mean? Alexander?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure it's kind of very helpful to think about in those terms. I mean, China is bigger, obviously, in terms of its economy and population, and so overall, potential for power in kind of world terms. But at the same time, is there anything, when you think about junior partner, what does it actually mean? Does China make Russia do something it doesn't want to do? Does it limit it in some ways which Russia wouldn't have been want to be limited? Does it tell us not to build pipeline there, but build pipeline here? It's all very much kind of vague and unspecified. What Russia wants now, of course, it's heavily dependent on China in terms of if China pulls the plug on Russia, it will really be stuck in terms of its ability to continue operating in terms of its economy and probably military and so forth. But so it does need China. That's no question about it. But at the same time, when you say junior, I think people need to be very specific about or vassal and so forth. What does it actually mean? I think there is a relationship which actually beneficial to both sides. So China needs Russia, not to the same extent that Russia needs China, but at the same time, it's not something which kind of just bullies around at this stage anyway. Potentially it could do if it wanted to, but would it need to do it or not? Because for China, if you think about China itself, it has a border problem with India, not kind of happy relationships. It has lots of border problems with Vietnam, with of course with Japan. Huge problem with America, with the United States, which building all this coalition against China around the Pacific. To have a problem with its northern neighbor, to have a problem with Russia on top of all those problems would be a total nightmare for China, of course. So for China to have a reliable neighbor to the north, which actually provides us with some strategic resources such as oil, gas, and grain and whatnot, plus giving it support politically overall is actually a quite important strategic asset. So I don't think that it's quite that way that Russia is just beholden to China and everything else. I think there is quite much more kind of mutually reinforcing relationship than people would like to assume.
Nigel, what do you think? Russia in this relationship with China has been described as nothing more than basically a warehouse of natural resources that China can now plunder. And also looking at GDP, I forget who it was. I think it was S&P or Ernst & Young, one of those guys, did a forecast 2050 and said that China is going to be 20% of global GDP. The States is going to be 20, EU is going to be 20, Russia's going to be 4%. So, it's stuck. It really is dependent on these. But do you think Russia is now just a warehouse of raw materials, or do you think it's a bit more complicated?
On the Russian GDP figure, I'd say 4% of global output is very optimistic, actually. It's more likely to be rather less than that. But to the larger point, I think Alexander's absolutely right that we need to be quite careful and precise in specifying what we mean by the terms with which we want to capture this relationship now. There's a lot of kind of loose terms thrown around, alliance or satrap or some kind of sort of dependent relationship. So what are we talking about exactly? So to me, the key to sort of capturing the distinction between China and Russia and therefore the relationship between them is firstly one of sort of interests. So Russia's interests right now are very specifically and urgently focused on this war that Putin didn't expect to be having to fight a year after his invasion. Everything increasingly both around the organization of Russian society and economy, and also its foreign policies being organized around this. And for China, they have a much broader, as it were, global portfolio of interests. And there's the complex and delicate, but certainly not broken relationship that China has with the United States and also with Europe, as totally different from the rhetoric that is coming out of the Kremlin about the burning of pretty much all bridges with the West. So Russia's interests are much more narrowly focused and limited. And corresponding to that, Russia's power as well, across all domains, I would argue, the weaknesses of Russia's position in the world laid bare by the war. And that's not true of China at all. So the consequence of all of this is that Russia's bargaining position on pretty much everything is far weaker than China's. So China is stronger, but also it balances its Russia relationship much more carefully with other interests that may not be in Russia's interests. And we can see this in quite specific detail. I just tweeted out about this just before we came on. So if you look at this over 5,300 word statement that Russia and China issued at the end of Xi's visit, there's nine sections to that. Right up there in section 2, you've got a very clear statement of Russia's firm support for China's position on Taiwan. Okay, it's pretty much exactly what China would have wanted. Buried down in the last section, section 9, below the language about biodiversity, you've got this much more ambiguous language about China's peace plan, and Russia appreciates China's interest in resolving the conflict in Ukraine. So there's very clear and direct imbalances in the relationship in that very text that they both agree.
I think one of the main take has been that Putin had to give everything away. That, as you say, everyone acknowledges he's in an incredibly weak position. He needs money, he needs arms, and he needs political support, and he needs some sort of legitimacy. And also the meeting very much was a boon for Putin domestically, because he needs to shore up support domestically to avoid any sort of, dissent against the war. However, I think for me to understand this is trying to work out to what extent this relationship is a two-way street. So we know that Putin is over a barrel, and the Chinese can take what they want. More interesting question, I think, is what does China want from Russia, and how much does it need Russia? Because if you do it in isolation and just look at the Russian position and the Chinese position, then clearly Putin has little choice, and he's got to get this gas deal done and whatever support he can get. But the Chinese, on the other hand, they need the materials as well. And before the war, they limited their oil imports to 15% from one supplier in order not to get exposed. But now that's gone through the roof, and they're buying a lot more oil. So they're introduced some sort of energy dependency, and the same would be true for the gas when the Para-Siberia 2 gets done, if it does get done. And also they've opened up their agricultural market. Soybeans in particular, which was mentioned in the final statement, is an issue. And the bigger picture is that China is going to have a problem with the States. It has a problem already. And the whole Taiwan thing is explosive. The militarization of the South China Sea. And now we've got we've just seen a much more assertive China. Because for me, the biggest takeaway is the fact that, in effect, Xi Jinping going to Moscow has challenged America for its leadership role globally, and that it stood up, and that Xi Jinping was playing as much to the global South as he was to Washington, to say, look, we're an alternative pole. If you've got problems with the Americans, then you can come to us and we can form an alliance against that. And I think a lot of the global South will be very receptive to that message, because, already we've seen Lula in Brazil come out strongly supporting Russia. We had an Africa conference the same day that Xi Jinping was in Moscow, where a lot of people came out in support of, quote unquote, Putin's multipolar world. And if you put it into that context, then actually China needs to have this alliance of all these other countries, non-aligned countries, if it's going to clash with the States. But Nigel, you're suggesting that that's not on the cards, that China's going to avoid that if it can. I personally think it's kind of inevitable, in so much as China now, we've just seen a new, much more assertive China appear on the international stage. And it's like starting on the road that Putin started on in 2002 after the States withdrew from the ABM. Nigel, why don't you go first? Do you think any of that makes sense?
Yeah, well, China's degree of economic interdependence on the West is very high, of course. And is interdependence, it goes both ways, investment and also trade. So it's sort of a familiar picture now, but we have this contradiction between, on the one hand, the growing geopolitical estrangement of Russia, China in the West, especially the United States. The recent balloon incident reminded us of the underlying sort of difficulties there. And on the other hand, this deep interdependence, which means a rupture in the relationship, is in economic terms in the interests of neither. Now, geoeconomics to some degree is responding to the geopolitics, and you're getting this sort of slow decoupling, but I think there are clearly limits to which that can go. And nothing like that, obviously, in the Russia-Western relationship. We've seen the dramatic sundering of what had been thought of as a very substantial degree of interdependence very quickly.
Well, it was. I mean, that's the point. It was interdependent. I mean, Russia's just lost its entire gas business. You know,
absolutely, in the blink of an eye. That's a policy going back to the early 1980s. It's absolutely astonishing. Just on energy, you made the point about the deepening energy relationship now between China and Russia. I suppose the first thing to say, you alluded to the visit that I think Putin made to Beijing in May 2014, just after what we must now call the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that's finally unlocked the decade or more long negotiations on the gas price, and you had a firm agreement finally. At a moment when Russia's position was very weak then, and the speculation is that, of course, China secured a very favorable price for the gas that would come to flow from that agreement in May 2014. You have something like a similar situation again, bargaining over the power of Siberia 2. That project still not officially confirmed, of course. Putin has talked it up, but there's nothing, I think, as you noted, nothing like that in the final communique. But again, Putin, Russia is the demandeur here. They need that much more than China. And as for China, they do have these other energy options. And of course, many noted the apparent ability of China to act as a mediator in the wake of the Iran-Saudi diplomatic breakthrough we've seen. That didn't only have diplomatic significance, it has economic significance. Iran and Saudi Arabia are both major energy producers. It's in China's interests, in purely energy terms, if their relationship improves.
But isn't that, I mean, I took that Saudi-Iran deal to be part and parcel of this new assertive China coming out onto the international stage, because before it was Belt and Road, it was largely economic. Everything it was doing foreign policy-wise was economic. And here it was doing pure diplomacy, bringing these two together, as you say, to shore up energy supplies. But it's, again, I thought it bolstered my argument that the Beijing is gathering together, like Russia's been doing, all of these non-aligned countries. Alexander, I mean, what's your view?
Well, I think what you said is right. I mean, despite the huge interdependency between China and the United States and Europe and so forth, I mean, the trend is very clear towards more and more antagonism. We can talk about, what's the causes and so forth, but it's clear it's coming from both sides. I think the Americans already imposing sanctions on China in very sensitive areas such as semiconductors, Huawei, and so forth. And that's regardless of Russia. So I think people sitting in Beijing, they know that they will try to undermine China's lead in key areas, regardless of what they do to Moscow or not. In that sense, I mean, China could do kind of collapse Russia in a sense, stop all the trade, impose, sanctions like America, United States did, stop trading with it and so forth. But why would they want to do it? It really needs Russia. It doesn't want Russia to lose, essentially, for its strategic interest. The NATO and United States invested so much into Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. It would be a huge victory for the West if Russia were to lose in Ukraine, but consequently it would be free up resources to focus on China, and weak Russia will even further undermine the Chinese position. So in that sense, China needs Russia to remain reasonably strong, because structural issue here, of course, will be competition between the United States and China for the foreseeable future. And if you think about power, I mean, where does China buy? Okay, so it buys from Qatar and from Iran and so forth, but it also buys from the United States and from Australia, big importers. The issue, everybody's building the controlling bases around the Pacific Ocean and approaches to China, having actually a supply of gas from Russia, which is not dependent on seaborne trade, is a huge boon for China strategically. That's the direction. It's so simple for China to think of it in that terms. That yes, it is a senior partner. It can be a senior partner, but at the same time, it doesn't really need to undermine Russia in any way. I mean, I don't see why.
Can we not cut this up? I mean, we've been arguing that the policy of the West in Ukraine is to make sure that Ukraine doesn't lose, and has been escalating with arms and supplies. Nevertheless, at the same time, policy is not to make sure that Ukraine wins by giving it faster, more offensive weapons ahead of the curve. But could you not say the same is true for China, that it needs Russia not to lose this war, because that would be a blow to it? It would take an important partner out if it assumes at some point, at least there's a very high possibility it's going to clash with the States. And at that point, Russia's support becomes very useful, no?
When China's nightmare is Russia either losing it altogether, or God forbid, becoming again aligning itself with the West. If it's aligned with the West, China is basically encircled. So for them to actually keep anti-Western government, or not, I mean, they're not keeping it. It's going to be a very strong kind of domestic roots and so forth. So it's not like telling Putin what to do or not. But the trend which Russia has set itself on this collision with the West is extremely beneficial to China, and I think it will be in its interest, the way they see it from Beijing, to support it if whatever is necessary. I don't think they actually need to do that very much. They can pretend to be neutral while maintaining all the economic links, and see how Russia will do.
While we're here, let's take a few minutes to talk about Chinese peace plan, because essentially the peace plan is not a peace plan in so much as it's just like Russia gets to keep everything it's captured, and you make the whole of Eastern Ukraine into a demilitarized zone, and the Ukraine is going to reject that out of hand. That's obvious. But at the same time, I see it that, China, by merely offering, the expectations are so low that it doesn't matter if no real peace comes out of this, just by looking like a mediator. Again, they're playing partly to the global South, saying, look, we're here, we're going to confront the West, we're going to back our friends. And China wins a lot of political capital merely by offering it. And I was reading in the American press that the White House has actually got a problem now, because if they really aggressively reject this peace plan, then again, that's going to play very badly with the non-aligned countries. In Europe here, everyone's committed. No question, we're going to reject the plan, and no one has a problem with that. But then the Chinese are already revving up to say, America doesn't want peace. They want the war to go on. It's a proxy war. Look what they're doing. The Russian media is playing that line already. And so the White House is actually having to pull back a little bit, and is trying to be a little bit more delicate. And I think this is actually the goal of the Chinese, or rather it's a win-win situation. It doesn't matter what happens, the Chinese will make capital out of this. Nigel, I mean, you've been looking at the plan. Do you think it's serious, or do you think something really subtle like that I just described is going on?
Yeah, so a couple of points here. Firstly, on the face of it, the peace plan contains provisions that are unacceptable both to Ukraine and the West, and to Russia, actually. So, I mean, take the first point alone, the principle of territorial integrity. Now, on the face of it, that implies that the war should be resolved on terms that respect internationally agreed borders. And that means the borders of 1991.
But that language got taken out of the final statement, didn't it? I mean, Xi Jinping said going in, and Wang in February were talking about integrity, but the final statement that came out in Moscow didn't have that language.
In Moscow, no, but the version of the peace plan that China published did have that. It also had language about respect for UN principles, one of which, of course, is territorial integrity. And as you observed, several of the other points in the plan would be unacceptable to the other side. So it's a non-starter as any basis for a settlement. The question then is, as you imply, what is the significance of the fact that China has done this at all? And I think perhaps what's underappreciated is the tension between China on the one hand, seeking to portray itself, or certainly Russia wanting to portray China as very close, as essentially supporting Russia, and on the other hand, China playing the role of a mediator. Now, you can do one or the other. You can't do both. You can mediate in a conflict, or you can side with one of the parties to the conflict, but you cannot do both at the same time. And I'm not sure that Russia quietly is happy at all that China has stepped in with his peace plan, because it does suggest, what a mediator does is get sides together and helps them agree. Russia, as you know, the core of its identity, especially under this leadership, is that it's a great power. Great powers aren't mediated for. Great powers decide their own fates. Great powers decide how the wars they engage in end. They don't need other states to do that. To help them do that. So the very fact that China has taken this different position, I think, is quietly unsettling to the Kremlin. And there was notably no great enthusiasm during the Xi visit for this plan at all. And the language that Putin used was, we are interested in this plan. There was nothing like an endorsement of it. Finally, to your underlying point about the global South, we'll see how this plays out, of course, and this has been a long-standing concern of Western policymakers, that while resolve within the West and Western public opinion about the war is strong, that pressure may grow in other parts of the world for it to end on terms that are more favorable to Russia. I suppose, one perhaps provocative question to ask there is, of course, it's always nice to have more countries on your side and taking your position, but in strategic terms, how much does it matter that the global South doesn't actually fully support Ukrainian position? And if we need a barometer of that support, look at no further than the latest UN General Assembly resolution, which 141, a year on, 141 countries voted to condemn the invasion. So, yeah, I'm not sure this amounts to so much that the West can worry about.
That's a key question, because Putin, in effect, has been forced into that. One of the takeouts for me, watching Putin for all these years, 20 years, he's been banging on about a single market from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And it comes back to this problem he's got in 20, 30 years' time, when they've got 4% of GDP and they're a minnow compared to the big blocks. And the Lisbon to Vladivostok idea was like, let's hook up with the EU and we'll join that, and then we'll be part of the biggest bloc. And so he was trying to have good relations. And by starting this war in Ukraine, he's effectively abandoned that. And that was the idea of setting up the EEU, the Eurasian Economic Union, because he couldn't join the EU, Russia's too big, but his idea was to set up an economic Eurasian Union. And that, I talked to the architect, and it was built as a carbon copy of the EU. The two are entirely compatible. And so he wanted to do some sort of deal whereby those two became linked. And the EU also has the useful role of tying in Central Asian countries. And so that China's forced to then deal with Central Asia, not on a bilateral basis, but as a multilateral with the EU, which is a balance to China. And Medvedev was out this morning, and another obvious thing for Russia to do is to try and bolster all these non-Western institutions. So you've got the EU as one, G20 is another one. Lavrov said there's no point joining the G7, they're no longer interested. And what was the other one? The New Development Bank, which is an alternative to the IMF, which was set up by China, Russia, India. And Medvedev was talking about all these, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They're trying to build all of this alternative to represent the emerging markets against or in the face of the West because they feel like the IMF is Western dominated, the World Bank is Western dominated, and they want their own institute. I mean, to what extent, and I think this has a lot of appeal to a lot of countries, they're interested in having these alternatives. To what extent are we seeing here a break in the world with because the developed markets are complaining, and this was the comments coming out of the Africa conference in Moscow at the same time just last week, was that, you have this colonial, paternal attitude to us where you're in charge, you lecture us, but, you can do what you like and you invade our countries and bomb us without UN mandates or without us attacking you. And we've had enough. We want to have some sort of chair at the table. The African countries are saying, why isn't there an African country on the Security Council? To what extent, Alexander, do you think the world's being broken in half here? Because China definitely, I think, with its visit to Moscow, was saying that. It was, and it's, its message to the global South as part of all of this is also saying that. It's like, let's club together and assert ourselves and get rid of this American-led hegemony of the West over the East.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's it's a sort of long-standing rhetoric, but I mean, just quickly go back to the Chinese peace deal. I mean, I think China is, in that sense, quite comfortable position. It doesn't commit itself to the same, choosing a side formally as the West done with Ukraine. For Russia to present the whole thing is actually us against the West, is, plays both to the domestic audience, but also to the global South, right? So this is a kind of this anti-hegemonic strike and so forth, and conveniently kind of skipping all the other things like the actual, place of Ukraine in it and so forth. But for China to come up with this peace deal, which is extremely vague, and I think it's designed to be vague and kind of not to be implemented, because I think it's all clear to everybody that nobody is anywhere ready to negotiate. But, for China to be seen as having not explicitly committed itself to one of those sides, like the West did, it's actually, as I said, plays up to, first of all, in the future, it could become hopeful, great power, not great power, but the mediator is would be probably needed at some point. And secondly, yeah, it can sell itself as it is for everything good in the world, right? Both for preserving integrity and containing NATO and so forth, as Russia is saying. But it's, fundamentally it's an issue of structural economic and geopolitical interests. If you have pretty much, China been talking about, and Russia, about dominance of American dollar and so forth, been trying to to create alternatives, not successfully. RMB still not world reserve currency and so forth. So there is this broad kind of understanding of the or for some form of anti-hegemonic, meaning Western and United States discourse in the South. But bottom line, you still deal with economics, with specific politics. India, has its own politics and its specifics. It's not going to join just for the sake of joining, right? Russia will join for anything now because they have no choice. But others, they have much more kind of balanced specific interest they have to consider, as well as this broad kind of anti-Western, anti-colonial discourse, which has been there for God knows how long.
Why? I can ask you concretely. We said that the Chinese plan is off the table. I agree that the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, are so far apart in their starting positions on where they might do talks. How will this war end?
I think it will end more or less where it is now. There's the line of the lines which are there on the map will probably, give or take, will probably be what we will end up in a few years' time anyway. There's a lot depends on Ukraine's ability to actually push back now, to break through and change the dynamic on the ground. They seem to be quite chippy about that and think they can break through. I'm not so sure. I think merely the head of the chief of whatever is the top American general, he's been extremely skeptical about ability to
Miller, yeah.
To break through. And I think that, once you have this well-entrenched Russian position, fortified and mobilized, I mean, the early Ukrainian successes were because of Russia's dire lack of actual troops, right? That simply didn't have enough to hold both positions. I mean, across Ukraine, been mobilizing much earlier than the Russia. But once you have this kind of dynamic, I don't know. I mean, obviously not military aspect, but reading military experts, to me, it seems extremely unlikely that either side can have a major breakthrough. We go to a war of attrition broadly along this line. Russia certainly can have bigger capacity in terms of able to hit Ukraine territory whenever it wants with missiles and so forth. And if you think about it, stalemate along the line, and then they're just constantly bombing the power grid and so forth and so forth. How long?
So where the Ukrainians down. Yeah. Nigel, do you agree? I mean, do you think this is going to go on for years? I mean, I don't see a negotiated solution. The only way to force it is if there's some sort of, ammo supply crisis, which could happen. But what do you think?
Okay, a couple of points. So, firstly, the course of this war has been extremely unpredictable from the start. There have been lots of surprises. Prepare for more. The conventional wisdom last summer was that this was grinding, attritional, World War I-like, and nothing much was going to shift for a long time. That was true until it suddenly wasn't. And you had these breakthroughs in the autumn around Kharkiv and then Kherson. That's just one example of when you roll the dice of Mars, they keep tumbling in surprising ways over time. So I'm far from confident that even in the shorter term, we have any clear sense of how it's going to develop, especially as Ukraine acquires steadily more sophisticated Western support of various kinds. Second point is, to the question, how will the war end, is to ask the question, what does an end to the war mean? And I think it's clear now that it's much more than just a question of where you draw lines on maps, because you have a whole series of kind of legal, international legal engines being fired up now. The question of accountability for war crimes, including Putin's own personal accountability, the question of reconstruction, the question of the terms on which sanctions would be lifted, the question of the return of adoptees, including tens of thousands of children from Russia back to Ukraine. And once you get these legal processes started, it's actually very hard to switch them off, even if you want to, and I sense no appetite there. And finally, and just perhaps to tie this back to the underlying theme of Russia-China relations, this is a war being fought on two fronts. One is on the battlefield between Russian and Ukrainian forces, and the other is on the home fronts of the respective participants. And the story on the Western side is that the West has remained remarkably unified, much more so than I think we could have expected, and certainly than expected. And that has manifested itself in escalation and support for Ukraine and in sanctions against Russia. That is a formidable superiority, latent superiority. The West is many, many, many times bigger and stronger and with a larger economy than Russia. So if it becomes, as it were, politically attritional, if it's a question of a contest for resolve between Western governments on the one hand and the Russian system on the other, it's actually very lopsided. But here's the China point. The thing we don't know at this point is whether there is or might in the future be any commitment on the Chinese side to provide countervailing support, including with deadly means to Russia, military technologies, equipment of various kinds. We just don't know. We know North Korea is providing it, and we know that China supports North Korea. Is that a route through, or more directly, could China actually provide, say, military drones, as the United States suggests it might? So one, I suppose, bleak prospect for a very long war, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's in the universe of possibilities, is that you have, in effect, the West supporting Ukraine and China supporting Russia. And that becomes the basis for something kind of very long and enduring. But But as going back to the earlier part of the discussion, there are reasons, I think, why China very, very cautious about doing that, because it needs that relationship with the West, however sort of fractious and difficult that relationship has become in recent times.
Let's talk shortly in the last quarter of an hour about sanctions themselves. As you say, the West surprised in the first week of the war that the unity that they showed. No one believed the EU could get that together. And the extremity of the sanctions imposed. The SWIFT sanction was like supposed to be a nuclear last minute option. It came out right at the beginning. The freezing of the central bank's money, no one even discussed that before when the tensions were high. And so that was a crushing blow. However, if the sanctions were designed in order to starve the Kremlin of money so it couldn't run its war machine, then they've been an abject failure. In fact, that Russia earns more money in 2022 than it has done ever since the independence 91, and moreover earned twice as much as 2021, which was also a record year. Spending that money is a bit more difficult, but that's another problem. And the technology sanctions, and this one really surprised me. I mean, that's something that the West controls completely. And yet you see the reports from the Free Russia Foundation showing that most of them have got through. And the same with the oil price cap sanctions, that although everyone's quoting the euro price has collapsed down to whatever it was, 37, I think, in June. Actually, the bulk of 85% of Russia's oil is going to Asia, and there it's being paid. The average then was $74 against $80 market price. So a discount of about $5, which is only slightly less than the discount Urals used to get before all these problems started. What's changed recently, to your point, Nigel, is that Borrell said a week ago that they've run out of sanctions. You know, they've hit Russia with everything they can think of, and any sanctions going forward do more harm to the West than they do to Russia. And what's changed, Blinken has been flying around, and suddenly we saw Turkey cut off trade. Suddenly we saw the Kazakhs saying, like, we're going to check everything. I just was in London talking to Georgians, and they said, no, everything's being checked now. We've turned 1,000 shipments away in the last week that were going through. And the idea, and von der Leyen was on the wire yesterday saying the 11th package isn't really going to contain anything new. What it's going to do is about closing loopholes. And I've described this as whack-a-mole, but your point about the West being so powerful is probably a good one, because I think Russia's on its back foot now, because if it does get cut off from all its friends, then it's going to be in real trouble. But this is not clear to me how this plays out now. If you're playing whack-a-mole, you have to nail all the holes shut. And that's going to be incredibly difficult to do, because traders are traders. You know, they'll find ways, they'll find new ways of doing it. I don't know, both of you, maybe Alexander, you can kick into that one. Do you think the sanctions have worked, or have they failed?
No, obviously they worked in the sense that they are imposed, real, pain on Russia in that sense. You don't, instead of selling. I mean, of course, the 22 was an exceptional year because it was still trading with Europe, more broadly speaking, with both oil, diesel, and even gas until. For first half of the year. So, I mean, is not going to be quite repeated. I think this year will be quite challenging for Russia financially because of all the kind of changes in logistics and so forth, and, tax system, etc. But I think broader point is that Russia hasn't collapsed. I mean, I think the expectations was that it would be such a severe blow that it's a shock to the Russian economy that still wouldn't be able to function. I think that didn't happen. First year actually was okay, and now we go into longer term, and a bit longer term. You basically, from my understanding, we're looking at all these various reports and so forth about sanctions, so forth. Russia will simply stop to adapt, right? It will continue to adapt itself. You can't completely block Russia off because, of course, it has the biggest land border with China, so it will still get. Trade with China, and China has no interest in stopping that. Yes, there could be issues that Chinese companies will have to choose whom they kind of prioritize. So I think there might be like a two-tier system. One company or banking system, big banks deal with Western type of goods, and then local ones or smaller ones, operate with Russia and so forth. But basically, kind of, what we're talking about it is, since there's been no collapse, like Europe will adapt to living without Russian gas, but buying it through LNG or consuming less. Russia will gradually adapt. Yes, it will be there'll be kind of bottlenecks, there'll be challenges and so forth. But broadly speaking, I think now we're moving towards a stage where Russia is really kind of decoupling itself from the West. Sanctions hurt, but not enough to actually, bring it down. And that's probably the prospects for the foreseeable future, that Russia is simply
That's the key point, isn't it? Sanctions hurt, but not enough to make it change his mind to actually stop the war. I mean, it's just adapted, and thanks to Putin's fiscal fortress, and thanks to his friends in, the market, the Chinese and Indians together have absorbed all of the 2 million barrels a day that used to go to Europe. They just found a new market outside the sanctions regime. They're going to have more difficulty with the products. And if the West cuts the technology off, it's failed to do that so far. But if it does, then that's also going to leave Russia to stagnate. But like you say, it's painful, but Russia can cope. I
think broad assumption in Russia that sanctions here are forever, essentially. Yeah. So they're not. There's no kind of incentive to change behavior, because I think even if they give up in Ukraine, most of the sanctions will remain. There are sanctions against China as well, because America doesn't want to have kind of China to lead in critical areas and so forth. So I think the broad assumption, sanctions been imposed, we just have to adapt to them, and that's what we start doing. There'll be costs, but as I said, the critical costs are not quite there, and I don't think they will be there anymore.
Nigel, do you agree? You think the sanctions are crippling, or is it something that Russia's just, its growth potential has gone from 2% because Putin was taking all the money that should have gone into investment and putting it into gold in the central bank to prepare for this war. And now the growth potential has gone down to 1%, which is, I don't know, it's stagnation over a long time. But I personally don't think Putin cares. That was the way the Soviet Union was run. You didn't bother with consumer products and prosperity. You built nuclear weapons. And I think Putin's in that frame of mind.
Well, one question there is how public opinion, how elite opinion responds to that. In Soviet times, they never really had experience of anything different. And now they have for pretty much 30 years. And they're losing something very quickly that they've got used to. But to the underlying points, so I agree with Alexander that the expectations among some that somehow these sanctions would cause a collapse of the Russian economy quickly were always unrealistic. And the sanctions story was unhelpfully oversold by sanctions enthusiasts. And there was an element of us going straw man there. That's never how sanctions work. I don't know of a single case of sanctions having caused any economy to collapse within a matter of months. Even a much smaller economy and less resilient economy than Russia. So that hasn't been kind of an informed or helpful view. And there were, unfortunately, some sanctions advocates who were saying it would do that. So we need a more sober and realistic and more historically grounded, I would say, view of what sanctions can do and over what kind of time frame. That happens, I'm writing a book at the moment about sanctions. I'm looking back at the things that happened in the 1970s and 1980s. And there was a proper degree of impatience with what was then called in diplomatic circles light switch diplomacy, the idea you press a sanctions button and things switch off. Again, that didn't happen then, it didn't happen now. So what are sanctions doing? They are disrupting flows into Russia and they're disrupting flows out of Russia. And the flows out of Russia, that's the thing to look at when we're considering the question of Russian public finances. You're absolutely right. It was a record year last year, but that, of course, was before the sanctions on the oil price cap in December, and then on oil products in February. And already the figures that we're seeing from Rosstat, to the extent they still publish them, because as you know, there are plenty that are now classified, suggest that their revenues have fallen very, very significantly. And already, I think 88%, 87% of the projected deficit for this year, a budget deficit, has already been reached.
We got a piece on the site this morning. It's actually 100%. 10 days of they've reached the whole thing. But again, there's a huge debate about that because I was talking to Chris Weaver about this, and he says, look, it's a one-off. And Mishustin was saying that they front-loaded a lot of the social spending that normally happens in December. They did it in January. So we have to wait and see until April whether they recover. And the oil guys are saying it probably will do. And as you know, the IMF came out and also said that there's going to be 0.3% growth this year. Because again, they assume that the oil market's working because you've got this huge hole with the oil being able to go to Asia, which takes up most of it. And Russia continues to earn lots of money that way. So I don't know, that's a very, I don't know, it's a very opaque question at the moment. We're in a couple of months at the moment.
They also have enough money to see them come through for a couple of years anyway.
Yeah, there's at least 3 years. Yeah.
They do, but things are slowly on all fronts getting more difficult. I very much doubt the Russian economy will grow this year. Even if it does, how is that manifesting itself in welfare for ordinary citizens? Russian defense spending and domestic security spending are increasing enormously. So I think the big picture is a shrinking pie and a steadily greater slice of that going into security-related spending, which doesn't make the lives of ordinary people better off at all. On the contrary, in fact, it makes the large-scale deaths of conscripted civilians in the field much more likely. So it's not a matter of light switch; it's a matter of a dimmer switch. Things will get worse on all fronts steadily in coming years for the population and for elites as well. And the question then becomes, how long can a regime like this sustain policies that are draining both blood and treasure from society before something changes as a consequence of that?
Doesn't that assume that the war continues endlessly for years? Because, I mean, you've got 1,000 companies that said they would leave. In reality, 9% have gone. 4% of German companies have gone. They're just sitting there waiting to restart their business. And some of them, like Alshan, are still actually working and investing and expanding. And they still have this subsidy of the oil and metals that they're now selling in Asia instead of to the West. That's always subsidized the Kremlin and allowed it to have corruption and inefficiency because it has this extra money to spend.
I mean, the issue of living standards and elites and so forth. I mean, it's all again. You have to kind of take it in perspective, in a sense that, I mean, I've been in St. Petersburg in December. I mean, things exactly the same as they were, in December before that. Yeah, it could be worse the following December, but it's all kind of gradual. There is a lot of, I mean, of course, they're spending on lots of money on the weapons, but Putin's constituency is actually Ural Vagon Zavod, which is the biggest tank factory. There was, it's not as simple as that. I mean, and that's, if you look at Russia's, yes, they had very good years, 2000s very early, but after 2000s, the living standards have been either plateauing, keeping at the same level, or going down a little bit. So I mean, it's the key is if there'll be sort of sudden, sudden or substantial deterioration in living standards that will cause it. But if it's just a gradual slide down, then maybe it won't be so problematic for them. The only thing is, of course, is that Putin has a re-election in 2024. And for that, there'll be a lot of pressure on them to increase, social spending on social welfare and so forth, and that could be difficult. But yeah, but I mean, it's all kind of long-term manageable, and that's my impression anyway. That it's there's not going to be just a sudden kind of revolution against it, because also I think I kind of sort of final point to make is that. Getting out of it is actually not that straightforward. I mean, how do you get out? You give up Crimea, you withdraw, you start paying reparations to Ukraine for foreseeable, forever and so forth. This is not kind of an appealing way out, even if you wanted to finish it. If you want to let's overthrow Putin and just get rid of Crimea and all the oil revenue we might have to pay for Ukraine. It's not an attractive option either.
I agree. And with you, Nigel, too, I think you're right. I think the issue there, though, with the shrinking pie and the falling standard of living, it's a question of time. And I think this is going to play out like Latin America, when Argentina used to be one of the richest countries in the world. And then just over a course of whatever it was, 10, 20 years, it just went backwards. And I think Russia faces a similar fate because of all these restrictions. But then that's not going to come quickly enough to change the politics, to see an uprising, to oust Putin, or even to, knock him from his pedestal. For the 24 elections that are coming up, he's totally in control of the media machine, and he's also got the people behind him, this nationalist patriot thing that he's done. And so I'm pretty sure that they'll vote him in again if he wants to stand again. Don't you think so, Nigel?
It won't be voting in a sense that we recognize. The elections will be more meaningless than ever. And that raises the question, if they are now truly, finally, obviously, and emphatically meaningless, do they cease to fulfill any kind of residual functions that might have been useful, even as a kind of pretense of legitimacy? There was that, of course, Navalny wasn't allowed to run in 2018. Elections were pretty meaningless then, but people still went out, and there still was a kind of performative, I don't know, veneer of a process. In a flattened landscape now, no independent media, no opposition figures or movements at liberty. If it really is something more Soviet than ever, of course, there'll be more than one candidate nominally on the ballot paper. It won't mean anything. Are we not in different territory now? And indeed, there's been some chatter from some of the hawks that they should postpone the elections. They're clearly not going to do that at this point. But the larger question, it's not about uprisings from below, it's about discontent from within. And again, we are entering very, very sort of speculative territory, but I think at least pose the question this way. How long can a leader whose fundamental policy makes the majority of the elite unhappy and alarmed and worried about the future? I think that's the case. I think most people who sort of matter in the system realize the war was a terrible mistake. They realized it from the very start. The body language of most of them is very awkward around this. There are the exceptions, and we can name them, of course, who are enthusiasts and are all in on this. Most of the, as it were, of the big people just want this to stop, I think. How long can a system sustain a situation where most of the people who sort of matter want the most important policy to change?
But I think the key point is that I think however much they shocked and don't like what happens. I mean, I think there's a realization that you simply cannot go back pre-war period. That's gone. There's not going to be a trade with Europe. There's not going to be any kind of yachts on the Riviera, on Côte d'Azur, and so forth. So I mean, we are in a different environment in that sense. And those who, the Russian elites, there's an intense competition. There's people who want to move away from Putin. There'll be like 20 of them who want to take the pace and suck up to him. So I mean, popular protest not going to happen. I don't think there will be kind of any elite protest either. So I don't think we are in this for kind of foreseeable future. That's why the way I see it. But yeah,
I agree. I'm in the popular. I mean, talking to people on the ground, our correspondents there. I mean, the people are fully behind Putin. They bought, they drank the Kool-Aid, and we're under attack by NATO. It's a proxy war, and we have to stand up because we're great Russia, and we're not going to,
But even if they wanted to, there's no way out. But without,
there's no way they can. Yeah, no. I mean, if they did stand up, as Navalny showed, then you immediately get thrown into jail, which is a problem. And secondly, with the elites, I don't know, they're fatalistic. I mean, the same mentality applies to them. And there's this sense, within the system, you just try and survive, you make your money, you get yourself comfortable. And actually the system provides a great deal of comfort for people at the top of the tree. And they're like, yeah, we've got this external problem, but actually I'm concerned with like moving this ownership of that company and that office to my wife over here, and I'm worth millions, and I can still go to the Maldives. There's no real restrictions on my nice life. I may have lost my house in Nice. It's this whole like God's too high and the Tsar's too far, and people's mentality is simply to deal with what they can and get what they can. So again, I think that just leaves you in a position where the whole system, like you say, Nigel, doesn't function, stagnate, but there's no possibility of any kind of revolt, either at the high level or at the street level.
The Tsar might be far away, but it doesn't feel far away when he's telling you have to go and fight in this war and die, or your husband does, or your son does. And that's why I do think the situation with public opinion is much more ambiguous and kind of complex and mottled than the sort of emphatic support would suggest. And evidence for that, particularly around what happened during the partial mobilization in September, that caused a great deal of anxiety. That's when the war really started for most of the Russians. And if more partial mobilizations become necessary, and from the wider population and not more from the prisons, then watch what happens. Really, I think that things are. It takes longer than you think, but then it happens faster than you expect in terms of kind of anxiety.
Indeed. Guys, we've run out of time, so I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. Fascinating, and still everything's up in the air. It remains very uncertain, but hopefully things will work out. Will be peace in Ukraine and stop the killing. That's, I think, the most important thing we can get to. So once again, to Nigel, Alexander, thank you very much, and for everyone outside watching, thanks for taking the time to watch us. Again, I point you to bne.eu/welcome, where you can find all sorts of goodies to follow up. Until next time, this is Ben Aris from me, Berlin, saying goodbye. Thanks again.